Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished guest speaker, James Rom. James Rom is a scholar and author who specializes in ancient Greek and Roman culture and civilization. He is the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College. Rom has written extensively about Seneca, including translating and collecting Seneca's thoughts on death in the book How to Die, An Ancient Guide to the End of Life. He's considered an expert on Seneca, having delved into the complexities of Seneca's life, character, and writings, shedding light on the moral dilemmas and philosophical depth of this ancient figure. Rom has written several books on Seneca, including Dying Every Day, my copy, How to Keep Your Cool, my copy, How to Have a Life, my copy, and, by the way, for the end of it, How to Die, also a useful one. I'm going to tell you, it's kind of just a quick back and forth with James before I say, please welcome him. James, these Princeton University Press books are just wonderful little things to be able to carry with you. They're like, every one of them is practically, a vade mecum kind of thing. I could just carry it with me and have it all the time. This is a great idea. I don't know if this is your idea over there, but these are fantastic.
Yeah, they're beautiful volumes, very handsomely produced, with irresistible colors on the covers. It's not my doing. It's an editor by the name of Rob Tempio at Princeton University Press who conceived the series, and it's become very successful. I think some of my volumes have gone into 12 languages at this point, so it's really getting a lot of attention.
Well, I'm glad that it comes out. The only thing is, it's like, they're so beautiful, and I love to carry them around, except for I'm always afraid if I'm carrying around either How to Keep Your Cool or How to Die, that people are going to get the wrong message if I show up in a coffee shop with that book in my hand. But I've done it, and I've had people run across the coffee shop and ask me about it. So I know that this whole thing is working good on Rob. I've met Rob somewhere in one of our events. But having said all of that, getting all my gushing out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming James S. Rom. James, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for your attendance. Just a little bit more background. I'm really a historian more than I am a student of philosophy, but my interest in history has to do with the ideas that are a part of ancient history, especially the people like Seneca who advanced those ideas. So my book, Dying Every Day, was a historical study, but also, of course, included perspectives on Seneca's thought. But it's mostly about his life, and I'm going to talk today about the connections between the life and the thought. Seneca had a very complex life. He was born right around the year zero. Well, there was no year zero, but around the turn of the millennium in the Roman Empire, and learned philosophy as a young man, was apparently a very intense young man, and so devoted to Pythagoreanism at one point that he became a vegetarian and was sleeping on the floor instead of on a bed, just to demonstrate his detachment from material comfort, things of that sort. But in addition to philosophy, he became interested as a young adult in politics. And the two made a very uneasy mix in the Roman world. In fact, one of Seneca's teachers had expressly forbidden the philosopher to go into politics, thinking that that would be incompatible with his philosophic career. But Seneca wanted to have it both ways. So he entered the Senate in his 30s, rose to prominence because of his great eloquence and speaking ability, became an enemy of Caligula, who was emperor at that time, and probably would have lost his life in the purges that Caligula conducted. But luckily for him, Caligula was assassinated before he could take action to eliminate Seneca. The next emperor, Claudius, was also not a big fan of Seneca, thinking of him as a threat, and had him exiled to the island of Corsica uh, to get him off the scene and out of politics. Seneca spent 8 years there, wrote the first surviving treatises that we have from him from Corsica, and might have spent the rest of his days there. But Claudius's wife, Agrippina, who was the mother of Nero, Claudius's adoptive son, decided that to advance Nero's claim on succession, his chances of becoming emperor after Claudius, that she ought to get him the best tutor, the best education possible, a very highly visible tutor. So she asked Seneca back to Rome to become tutor to 13-year-old Nero. This is about 49 AD, around the midpoint of the first century AD. Seneca came back from exile, was made a member of the palace inner circle, and a kind of a surrogate father to Nero, whose own father had been killed in his youth. And Claudius was his adoptive father, not a very nurturing figure. So Seneca and he became very close. When Nero ascended to the throne, to the emperorship in 54 AD, Seneca was his principal advisor and his chief minister. And since Nero was only 17 at that point, Seneca was doing a lot of the heavy lifting of running the Roman government, running the empire. It's an astonishing story for a man who was publishing moral treatises, who claimed that his interest was really in the stars and the heavens and natural phenomena and moral principles, to be at the highest levels of government of the Roman state. The essay that forms the basis of my translation, "How to Keep Your Cool," which Phil showed you a few moments ago, was published at around the time of Nero's accession to power. So around the time when Seneca entered the highest levels of government in the early 50s AD. And I'm going to argue that that date is significant for understanding the purposes of the treatise. Ostensibly, his treatise, called De Ira in Latin, on anger, perhaps in English, although it's ira is an even stronger word, maybe on rage. It's one of a series of Seneca's moral treatises published in midlife, in which he examines individual topics having to do with moral principles or moral qualities. So on anger, on the happy life, on wisdom, on the search for wisdom, things of that nature. There's a huge number of these that survive. Seneca's corpus is very large. The Letters, as some of you know, is a huge work, occupying several volumes in its entirety in the modern editions, making him more difficult and a harder study than either of the other Roman Stoics. Epictetus, who he didn't write anything, but his student Arrian produced only very short works of his, and Marcus Aurelius, who has only the one text, Meditations. Seneca's voluminous. So, getting back to De Ira and the early days of Nero's reign, is an extensive discussion of anger, arguing that this is the most dangerous emotion for a philosopher, for a budding Stoic. It has the most destructive potential of any of the passions. It's equivalent to a wildfire that rages out of control, or in one of Seneca's analogies, to get angry is like jumping off a cliff. You speed up as you go, and there's no stopping until you crash. It's impossible to control once it gets started. So Seneca's goal is to prevent it from getting started, and he gives you lots of practical tips on how to achieve that. Excuse me, I have a bit of a scratchy throat. He goes to such lengths in his essay on anger to convince us not to allow anger to get control, that he uses analogies that are appalling in most people's view. For example, a man who has had his son murdered by Caligula in one of Caligula's sadistic lashings out. He killed this man's son simply because the boy had long hair and Caligula didn't want anyone having more beautiful hair than he did. Then he invited the father, the bereaved father, to the palace and cruelly forced him to put on a festive garland, to drink and revel and celebrate as though nothing were wrong, with guards watching over him to make sure that he showed no sign of grief. And somehow the man managed to do this, managed to swallow his anger and grief and put on his garland and drink and revel. And Seneca approves of this and says, literally, this is the way you behave at the court of a king. You smile even at the murder of your children. So that's a chilling example of us would be capable of, but Seneca uses it as a kind of extreme case of what he thinks is advisable, the total suppression of anger. He compares the lot of a moral person to a sponge diver who gradually trains himself to hold his breath for longer and longer periods so that he can dive down and collect sponges off the bottom. If you practice the right discipline, Stoic discipline, and build up day by day, you will be able to totally overcome anger. He gives other historical examples of people who, at the court of kings, were subject to abuse, cruelty, sadistic treatment, and managed to put a good face on it and just smile. Again, many of us would find this impossible and perhaps repellent, but this is the case that Seneca makes. He has other essays that are not so extreme, that are much more moderate in their treatment of anger, but in De Ira, his one focused treatment of anger, he's extremely explicit not to let anger even get a toehold in the soul. He admits that for the wise man, what the Romans call the sapiens, the sage. So some of you are familiar with the Stoic concept of the sage, the sort of Zen master, the ideal human being who always does what's right and always knows what's right. Such people, Seneca admits, hardly ever exist, maybe only once in 1,000 years, but nevertheless, it's an ideal that should be strived for. The sage will, he admits, experience a tiny moment of instinctual anger when confronted with an extreme abuse. But it's possible to let that anger pass, to diffuse a moment later the anger that had started to emerge and dispel it. So there's an instinctual response, but can be defeated by the rational mind, the logos, as the Stoics like to call it. The discussion goes into a lot of diverse territory, but the final message is we mustn't ever let ourselves get angry. Now, remembering the biographical context, that this was the moment when Seneca had been brought back from exile. He'd been abused by Claudius. He'd been sent to Corsica for no good reason, simply to get him off the political scene. He'd spent 8 years there in the wilderness. Well, he lived rather well. He was not, camping on the beach, but nevertheless, he was out of Rome, where he wanted to be. For him to publish an essay diffused to the wide Roman public, especially the political elite, that disclaimed all anger, especially anger brought about by mistreatment by kings, has biographical resonance, right? This is self-referential, inevitably. And my goal in Dying Every Day, and my goal here today, is to try to disentangle or intertwine the biographical story, the remarkable rise to political prominence of a man like Seneca, with the philosophical treatises. To my mind, they're inseparable. It was much to Seneca's political advantage at that moment to show the Roman elite, I'm not angry. I'm willing to let bygones be bygones. And if I'm established at the center of power, which he clearly was, I'm going to make sure there are no reprisals. I'm not going to get even with anyone. I'm just going to get on with life and let bygones be bygones. So there's a self-interest in the message of the era, as there is in many of Seneca's later works, and indeed in the whole project of publishing moral philosophy. At the court of Nero, who very early on revealed himself to be a kind of a Looney Tunes, right? A delusional monarch who was willing to do crazy things like singing on the public stage, racing in chariots, behaving like a low-level pop star, while occupying the highest position in the Roman pantheon. A man like that required a counterweight, required someone of moral seriousness to reassure the empire that things were in good hands, in Seneca's hands. And so the moral treatises published during Nero's reign, to my mind, inevitably have that secondary purpose of political stability in the hands of a wise man.